Common Sense Radio.
Bunch of drunks.
7:10 and Damon is on the line. What's up, Damon? Hello, Damon.
Hey, hello?
Hello, yes, please. What's up?
Yeah, so how is it that Trump, I mean, you rail against the reporter for interpreting Trump's words, but then you turn right around and interpret his words yourself?
This is great, people. You know what? Happy days are here again. Damon just called the show and railed on me for being mean to Donald Trump and interpreting his language. That's how far we've come. The resistance movement has now become a movement where they're looking out for the interests of Donald Trump. But what a transformation. Can it get any better than that? Damon calling in, and he's not happy that I interpreted the words of President Trump. That's coming from the left now. We have finally gotten them to the point where they have so little to talk about and complain about that now they're complaining in defense of Donald Trump.
It's a good day.
It is amazing. Resist, we munch. Well, I was interpreting President Trump because I was just trying to... The fuel efficiency standard line was a complicated one. The people who were in that room understand it, but I wanted to drive home the point that he is going to be rolling back fuel efficiency standards. That was the conclusion within that statement of his. So that's why I was interpreting President Trump. But Damon, wow, what a turn.
Now he's got Trump's back.
Don't be mean to Donald Trump. That's from Damon. Oh, we got everybody on board now. Except for Bow Wow.
Darn.
And Snoop Dogg. Bow Wow, who threatened on Twitter to pimp out Melania. That was his line there. Which I tweeted out yesterday. I said, well, I don't know. You can look at it positively. And that he's offering to treat Melania better than his own women. So that's good. Right?
Always looking for the positive.
I'm always looking for the sunny side of the street. Especially when happy days are here again. Damon calling into the show. You be nicer to Donald Trump, says Damon. Oh, yes. This is fantastic. All right, so two really great speeches yesterday, both of them with varying different kinds of tones. The one in Michigan that I was referring to with the fuel efficiency standards, that was more of a meat and potatoes, nuts and bolts, I'm talking to the working man speech. And the speech in Nashville in honoring Andrew Jackson's 250th birthday, essentially, was designed more of as a loftier, wide-ranging thematic speech that was really good. And it's interesting, I will tell you, humorously, he referred to Andrew Jackson and how he feels for Andrew Jackson based on what Andrew Jackson went through back in the day. Yeah, cut number 5 here.
It was during the Revolution that Jackson first confronted and defied an arrogant elite. Does that sound familiar to you? I wonder why they keep talking about Trump and Jackson, Jackson and Trump. Oh, I know the feeling, Andrew.
Well, and you know, most of the time when he's compared to Jackson, it's in a negative way because they talk about Jackson being a populist and authoritarian and an Indian killer and whatever you want to throw at him. But one of the most important aspects of the speech, cut number 8 here, because now we're digging in on something that I think is very important and representative of what we saw on November 8th. Here he's talking about Andrew Jackson, the
They
campaign.
say that his campaign and his whole thing was most like mine. That was, it was interesting. That was 1828. They used to go back to Ronald Reagan. Now they're going back to Andrew Jackson.
Yeah, so 1828, the country was, shy of 40 years old. And Andrew Jackson, because here's the thing, I'm working on this project regarding Rachel Jackson, and there's symmetry there between her and Melania as well, and I'll get to that in a second. Because Rachel Jackson actually, I would argue, quite possibly was most capable of being the first female president of the United States. That's how strong she was. But anyway, Andrew Jackson, when he came on board, came onto the scene, it was the first time anybody from outside of the Eastern Seaboard was running for president. He was from Appalachia. He was from the South. And most of the presidents, the leaders of the country, were people who were from Virginia, Maryland, they were all from the Eastern Seaboard, and it was an elite group of people. And of course, I'm not trying to say that's always a negative thing. I mean, let's face it, Madison and Jefferson and Washington, I mean, they're not a bunch of, in my opinion, elitist people, but the people around them certainly were, especially when Andrew Jackson came on board. And in fact, there was a great deal of animus between Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams, and to a certain degree, James Monroe, too, who were all from that area. But Rachel Jackson wound up being kind of a key to the connection there, because her father actually was in D.C. He was one of these guys who was a person who knew a lot of these people. And so when Rachel Jackson was growing up, she met people like Madison, and she had actually known him as a little girl.
Wow.
Basically. Her family wound up founding Nashville. They were run out by the Indians and then came back and founded what is now Nashville, and her whole family there, the Donaldsons. So anyway, during that campaign, he was considered to be he was basically what we would call a Hoosier right now.
Right. I didn't know that.
But he was also a war hero, and he was no slouch when it came to and he's a lawyer, and he was no slouch in that degree. But because he wasn't from the Eastern Seaboard, he was considered not good enough to be part of that group. And indeed, even though John Quincy Adams and Monroe and those guys didn't like him, their wives loved Rachel. And so she'd go up there, and Rachel Jackson smoked a pipe. She smoked a little silver pipe. And so she went up there, and she'd hang out with John Quincy Adams' wife and James Monroe's wife, and they loved her. They all got along great, which is kind of how he managed to pull off a lot of what he did in terms of easing the minds of the elite in the Eastern Seaboard. So then what happened was, though, as a campaign tactic, it was the first time that a candidate's wife ever became cannon fodder in a campaign. And Andrew Jackson never forgave these people for what they did. So basically they accused her of being an adulterer, because what happened is she was married before Andrew Jackson met her. She got divorced, but the guy who divorced her purposely really kind of didn't divorce her. And because of the paperwork issue, she was considered to be an adulterer since she married Andrew Jackson without actually officially being divorced. Jeez. So they would put out these pamphlets.
This is complicated.
They would put out these pamphlets and stuff calling her basically,
Wow.
An adulterer. And it was devastating to her, and certainly devastating to Andrew Jackson, who at one point got involved in a duel over comments made about her. So ultimately, what happened was, because of Andrew Jackson's populist message, he was a Democrat, but boy, nothing like the Democrats now, but he was a Democrat, and he managed to win that election. He won the election, the hard-fought election, in spite of the fact that his wife was maligned, and you could see the symmetry with Melania because she was equally maligned by the people, not only on the left, but also on the right. Because you remember the Ted Cruz people and all those folks who put out those pictures of her, basically tried to make her out to be some kind of Jezebel because she had pictures taken of her without any clothes on. And that was similar to the way they treated Rachel Jackson. The saddest part about the whole story is that President Jackson, he becomes president of the United States, and a month before his inauguration, Rachel Jackson dies. Oh, man. She was so devastated by being called a Jezebel herself and an adulterer and everything else. It was a horrible thing for her because she not only was the person who she and Andrew Jackson were, their love letters are crazily beautiful with each other. They were devoted to each other. And so she was at home and she'd take care of the kids. And one of the kids actually was an Indian child snatched off a battlefield during the Indian War that they adopted. But anyway, she winds up being buried in her inauguration gown. And so by the time Andrew Jackson gets up to D.C., he is beyond PO'd. And he goes in, and and this is where to the victor goes the spoils comes from. He went in, and he basically just absolutely cleaned house. A lot of it had to do with his promise to the people to be a people's president, but a lot of it also had to do with the fact that he never forgave these people for the way they treated Rachel Jackson. So it was a really tough time, but there are a lot of similarities between what's going on with President Trump, and because they also tried to make it as hard as possible for Jackson to succeed. Which is exactly what they're doing now with Donald Trump. So there's a lot. So there's more than meets the eye when President Trump is down there, and why he hung the portrait of Jackson in the Oval Office and everything else, because it means a lot to him, and there's a lot of symmetry there. And yeah, I know people bring up the Trail of Tears. I get it. I get it. But that was the time. I mean, try being the Donaldson family in Nashville and being attacked by the Indians every time you turned around, to the point where you had to flee and then come back. So I mean, it was. I'm not saying it went both ways, but there was a tumultuous time there between the Indians and the Americans. Jim Talon, everybody. At Jim Talon on Twitter, AAI.org. Hey, what's up, buddy?
Well, not much here, but I'm ready to answer any and all questions. I'm like the professor at Gilligan's Island. You ask me anything about politics.
Right, exactly.
I pretend to be an expert on it.
Yeah.
Old Hickory. Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, he was Jackson was the first populist president. He came in and pretty much cleaned house.
Yeah.
And I think you've summed up the reason. He never forgave those his detractors for what he thought they did to Rachel.
Yeah.
And they had they'd gone on that quest for the presidency together, and then she died before he could take office. And that and the Peggy Eaton case actually ended up changing the way America was governed, because Jackson moved away from cabinet government because he didn't trust his own cabinet secretaries. He was the first guy with a kitchen cabinet.
Yeah, right. Well, and people are calling like Jackson wasn't a nice person and he killed Indians, and I get it. But Jackson actually, first of all, these people don't know what kind of person Jackson was. It's just based on what they've been able to read. And Jackson, on a number of different levels, was not only a person who cared deeply about his family and also about his country, and was a war hero, and was also a person. First of all, he owned slaves. I get it. You know who he's buried next to, right? A slave. He and Rachel demanded that a couple of their slaves be buried right next to them in that courtyard there at the Hermitage, and so and also adopted an Indian child from the battlefield. So, I mean, there are a lot of things you could say positively and also a lot of things you could say negatively, but I could probably do that about everybody. Tammy called in. I could probably pick a few things about Tammy's life that I don't like either. But that's just the way it goes.
That's true. I mean, we tend today to put the political leaders we like on a pedestal in terms of their personal character, and the ones we don't like, we put, in the sewer. And the truth is that most of them have strengths and weaknesses, just like everybody else. There are some, there are some people I've met in politics over the years that I thought were just outstanding human beings. Not many.
Yeah.
But that's true in life, isn't it? I mean, and it's what you want is to match people's strengths to the tasks that they have to do, right? So you want the right person at the right time for a particular job.
People lived a hard. This is the 1820s. People lived a pretty hard life back then. I mean, there were people. There were not a lot of very sunny people. Because when you lived a life, like for instance, I just go back to my own family history on my mom's side, where up in Pennsylvania, you'd have a family of 10 whittled down to about a family of 5 over one winter because of the deaths of the children and everything else. So people lived a pretty hard life back then. It was not easy living back in those days as an American.
My parents were both Depression era people. And, my mom was raised on a farm, was in our family for about 150 years, and they hauled water. They didn't have running water when she was a kid. And so it's hard for us to envision what that kind of life is like. They did not have the luxury of, of the kind of distinctions and nuances that we make all the time. Having said that, Jackson did some pretty bad things.
Yeah.
There's no question about it. It's like you do have to judge people in history according to the mores of the time in which they were living. Some of them are able to rise above it. I mean, Lincoln was, and he's one of my heroes. But most of them are pretty much the product of their times. And if you want to have a balanced and accurate judgment, you have to keep that into account.
Yeah.
Context is always important. I'm going to write a column someday about that context is really important. You have to understand the circumstances in which people are operating.
You absolutely
I know you wanted to talk about U.S. attorneys, speaking of context.
Yeah, I'm loving the fact that this whole thing, that this fake news angle on the New York U.S. attorney and how he was basically, that was like firing the Pope. But I'm glad some daylight's coming out of this. And this guy, was he a good, solid attorney? Yeah. Did he have a few hiccups? Yes. Was he a shameless self-promoter? Yes. But the bottom line is this is nothing unusual in terms of how presidents operate once they get into office.
Yeah, particularly in that district. I mean, there have been a lot of really good prosecutors who were self-promoters in that district because it's a jumping-off point if you have political ambitions, which this guy pretty clearly does. There's 2 reasons why presidents tend to replace these people. One of them is that they are political actors in the sense that where you choose to put your enforcement resources is in part a political decision. So if Rand Paul were elected president, his attorney general would probably want to de-emphasize certain kinds of drug investigations and prosecutions, right? I don't mean to misstate Senator Paul's position. I'm just using it as an example, right? So that's a policy decision, where you put your enforcement resources. And the other reason is because you want to promote and have people in your administration who supported you, if you can. I mean, that's a pretty. Most of us would want our assistants and our subordinates to be people who want our mission to succeed politically, right? Or in business or in radio, right? I mean, your whole team is pro Jamie.
Yeah.
Most of the time.
Yeah. Whatever. Hey, but no, I think you're right. When you look at what Bill Clinton did to 93 U.S. attorneys gone in a matter of hours when he took the presidency over. But we talked so long about history that we had to cut short on this conversation. But still, Jimmy, thanks a ton, as always, at Jim Talent, AEI.org. Always good to talk to you, brother.
Okay, man.
All right, 969-9797, 866-455-9797. Don't forget Chris Wallace in this morning.